to the Gladstone Institutes. My name is Dr. Warner Greene. I'm the director of the Gladstone Institute of Virology and Immunology. Our mission here at Gladstone in San Francisco is to use science to overcome disease. Today's topic is one that is certainly in the news, the Zika virus. We will have an expert in the field of Zika virus, flavivirus biology, share her thoughts with us. But first, I would like to begin by sharing a few thoughts in terms of global health, the impact of viruses in our daily lives, and how this is really changing. Without a doubt, the recent outbreak of Ebola in West Africa emphasized the tenuous nature of and the interconnected nature of our relationship with throughout the world to various infectious agents. So currently, the world population is increasing. Right now, there are 7.4 billion people who live in the world. By 2050, the population may rise as high as 11.2 billion. We see, in fact, that most of the population growth is occurring in the less developed countries of the world. Where health systems are not as well developed. So this is an important issue that will continue to impact global health going forward. So what are people dying of throughout the world? Indeed, infectious disease is causing more than 1 out of every 4 deaths worldwide. We see that more people are dying of cardiovascular disease slightly, but worldwide, about a quarter are dying of infectious disease. Now, if you look at children under the ages of 5, nearly 2/3 of the deaths occurring in the world of children under 5 is related to infectious complications. So here we see, in fact, an example, a summary slide of the world, where, in fact, we're looking at emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. You see that, in fact, this is a very crowded slide. There are many types of infections that are either emerging or re-emerging. Today, the topic is the Zika virus, which, in fact, has broken out or more new infections occurring in Brazil. Certainly, this virus was first discovered in Uganda and Africa. There were episodes in the Pacific Islands, outbreaks there. But now Brazil and parts of Pan America are bearing the brunt of new infections. So my final slide, I just want to make the point again that we live in a physically more connected world. What's happening in other parts of the world are bound to affect us here because of this connectivity. Distance and speed of travel have increased over 1,000-fold since 1800. 1.4 billion air travelers per year. And of course, the global trade of food, animals, and plants further encourages the spread of various infectious agents. So with that prelude, it's a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Melanie Ott, Senior Investigator at the Gladstone Institute of Virology and Immunology, Professor of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, to talk about the Zika virus. After the presentation, Melanie will be joined by Dr. Krystal Fontaine for a question and answer period on the Zika virus. We invite all of your questions, and we look forward to a stimulating and interactive informational briefing. So with no further ado, Melanie, welcome.
So hello, everybody. Thank you, Warner, for the introduction. Zika emerged at the beginning of last year in Brazil as a mysterious disease, but a rather mild disease that presented with a rather unspecific rash, low fever, joint pain, and red eyes. But what has emerged as a rather, mild and local disease has quickly turned into a global public health concern, with thousands of babies born with small heads and potentially debilitating brain disease, a condition called microcephaly. So today we have about 1.5 million people infected with the Zika virus in Brazil, more than 4,000 reported cases of microcephaly, and in February 1st, 2016, the World Health Organization made a connection between these two things, and declared Zika virus a public health emergency of international concern. And 1 week later, President Obama included in his budget proposal to devote $1.8 billion to combat the Zika virus. So a very rapid development. So what happened? As Warner mentioned, the Zika virus emerged in Uganda as a virus with very little name recognition. It spread, it was discovered in the 40s, and it spread initially locally to some neighboring countries in Africa, specifically Nigeria, and then made the jump to Asia, where it infected, where infected cases were reported in Malaysia and in Cambodia, and from there spread down to the Pacific Islands, specifically to Tahiti in 2013. And from there, it's not on the map here, it actually moved to Brazil, presumably in August 2014, when sportsmen from the Pacific Islands competed in a canoeing world championship and are suspected to have brought the viral infection to Brazil. And here from Brazil, it has now already spread locally to other areas here, specifically Colombia and Mexico. And when you look at this spread of the infection here, it overlays perfectly with the distribution of the mosquito that is actually transmitting the disease. And this is the Aedes aegypti. It's one of the major vectors for this disease, but other mosquitoes in the Aedes family also are able to transmit the disease. But you can see that wherever the mosquito is, mostly this is where the virus has been reported. The virus is named after the Zika forest in Uganda, which is an outpost of the Uganda Virus Research Institute, which was established in the 40s as a site to research yellow fever. Especially rhesus macaques were used here to identify the vector that transmit the yellow fever virus. And so one of these rhesus macaques, the monkey 766, is the one that became febrile in 1947, and from its blood, the Zika virus was isolated. And a few years later, it was also isolated out of the Aedes vector that is circulating there in Africa. It was reported in 1952, first time, by 3 co-discoverers, George Dick, Alexander Hadov, and S.F. Kitchen, who I could not identify further, neither by his first name nor by a picture in the literature. And George Dick actually went on in 52 and published a back-to-back paper with the first paper that reported the isolation of the Zika virus, where he characterized the symptoms associated with Zika virus and the virus itself a little bit further. And what we know today about the virus is already very much described in this initial paper. So what he described in 1952 is that the virus is actually very highly neurotropic. That means it likes to replicate in the brain or in the nervous system. And it was isolated from the blood of the rhesus monkey by injecting the blood into the brain of young mice, and this is how the virus could be amplified and isolated. He also performed experiments to determine which species the virus can infect, and found that it replicates in mice if it's injected in the belly. Not very good in adult mice, but relatively well in young mice. It replicates in monkeys, causing very little disease, and not by George Dick, by another researcher in the 60s, who performed a self-inoculation experiment and actually showed that the virus causes disease in himself. It has also shown that it indeed infects humans. So this is a rather spectacular confirmation of the Koch postulate. But George Dick already tried to infect guinea pigs, cottontail rats, and rabbits, and all these were not permissive for the virus. He also filtrated the virus and identified the infectious unit as being about 35 to 45 nanometer in diameter, and that's exactly what we find today in electron microscopy reports. And in a later report, not by George Dick, by another researcher in the 70s, who described the infection in the brain of the mouse in more detail, it was established that actually neurons and the surrounding glia cells in the brain can become infected. And a very recent paper in Journal of Virology has shown that it can infect skin cells and associated immune cells like immature dendritic cells, establishing how the virus can spread from the bite of the mosquito from the skin to the body. So what is the Zika virus? The Zika virus is a so-called flavivirus, similar to the yellow fever virus, the dengue virus, or the West Nile virus. All of these viruses also transmitted by mosquitoes. The transmission occurs when the mosquito takes a blood meal from a person who is infected and symptomatic or just replicating the virus, and then spreads the virus to the next person, because the mosquito becomes basically infected, its salivary glands become infected, and when it feeds on the next person, the virus becomes injected into the bloodstream via the saliva of the mosquito. And that continues to the next person, because the mosquito, by the way, it's only the female mosquitoes who are blood feeding. One mosquito lives about 3 weeks. The virus doesn't do any harm to the mosquito, and so it can infect a lot of people during the 3 weeks of its adult lifespan. What we know about the molecular virology of the virus is very little so far, but we deduct a lot of the other from the knowledge we have from the other flaviviruses, namely the dengue virus, which is a very close relative. We know that the virus sort of carries a single-stranded positive strand RNA genome, which encodes all the information that the virus needs for its life cycle, that when the virus comes into a cell, gets uncoded, and then immediately serves as the transcript for the production or the translation of a long polyprotein that is being cleaved into 10 viral proteins. And these 10 viral proteins then have two major tasks. One is to form a replicase complex that usually happens at these viral factories along the ER or endoplasmic reticulum here, to replicate and make more viral RNA. And this more viral RNA is going to serve to be introduced into new virions. The second class of proteins serves to basically generate new virions as structural proteins to actually encapsulate the RNA and then build new viruses that are being secreted to infect other cells. There's very little what we know what the Zika virus specifically is doing, but the recent paper in Journal of Virology has already shown that some of the binding molecules at the surface of a cell, like the so-called receptors, are similar and shared between Zika and the dengue virus. And we don't know yet which of these, whether one of these molecules are a bona fide Zika virus receptor. The paper in 1971 already showed in infected neurons in the mouse these very characteristic viral factories, which are membrane proliferations in the cytoplasm that protect the virus, the viral RNA from degradation and lets it replicate unhindered. And then we have more and more images now about the Zika virus itself, how it's formed and leaving the infected cell. It is about 40 nanometer in diameter, as predicted in the 52, and it looks very much like other flaviviruses that you can visualize. But there's something specific about the Zika virus that differentiates it from the other flaviviruses, and one is that we had 2 reports of sexual transmission between a man and a woman. And this is unusual. This has not been reported before of any other flavivirus. It has to be noted that in the 2 cases where this has been reported, there must have been, or there seemed to be also an infection or an inflammation of the sexual organ, the male sexual organ, because in both cases it was reported that there was blood in the semen, which could be the reason why the sexual transmission has taken place. The other important difference of the Zika virus is that we have transmission from a mother to baby during the pregnancy. And this is something that has been very sporadically reported for dengue virus, but not for other viruses such as, for example, West Nile virus. And this is the reason why we get so concerned, because that is the reason why microcephaly can occur. Now, initially, when the numbers have been reported in Brazil, which were vastly higher than the regular numbers of microcephaly in the area before, people had been cautious because very little confirmed Zika cases were, or very little of the cases were actually confirmed to carry Zika. So there were only 17 babies in which Zika was really found in the baby. And others argued that these numbers were mainly coming because only the head circumference was measured rather simply, and there were no refined examinations of the brain, so nothing could be said about whether this was really microcephaly or just smaller heads. And then there's a very high rate of toxoplasmosis in Brazil, and toxoplasma is another pathogen that can cause these congenital malformations, especially of the brain. However, this has pretty much all been put to rest by a paper that came out yesterday in New England Journal of Medicine by Slovenian doctors who isolated the virus out of the brain from a diseased microcephalic baby, and also showed very broad range neuronal damage in that baby. And the same was also reported in a press conference yesterday by the CDC. So there is clearly neurotropism of the virus in the brain, and the numbers of the viral RNA that have been recovered in the brain are way higher than the numbers that we are usually recovering from, the blood of infected adults. So the idea is really supported that the virus has a very specific neurotropism and causes havoc, especially when the transmission occurs very early in the pregnancy. Interestingly, the brain was among the only organs that was infected in the baby. No other organ was infected by the virus, with the exception of the eyes. And the eyes have independently also arisen as another source of concern in Zika virus infections, because many babies that have microcephaly also have widespread damages to their retina, and are at risk to being blind. And the doctors are now cautioning that even if the baby is born with a normal head, there might be other problems that might be associated, especially in the eye. And we are reminded here very much of that the eye is an immune privileged site and causes often problems in viral infections. For example, in Ebola survivors, this is where the virus persists even when all other symptoms have gone. And so you might ask, okay, I'm maybe male or I'm a woman and I'm not planning on getting pregnant. Why should I care so much about the virus? There's a third condition that is emerging to be associated with the virus, which is called the Guillain-Barré syndrome. And this is affecting just anybody who has been infected with the virus. Now, the Guillain-Barré syndrome is not something that is specific to Zika. It is a condition that has been observed after viral infections in general. But it has been reported to be in French Polynesia and 2013 and 14, there was a 20-fold increase in Guillain-Barré syndrome reported. And now in Brazil, we have about a 3 to 5-fold increase in Guillain-Barré syndrome reported there so far. Now, what is the disease? The disease is not very nice. It is a progressive paralysis that often starts in the feet and sort of moves up, feet and hands, and sort of moves up and can lead to difficulties with breathing, and people with Guillain-Barré syndrome can end up in the intensive care unit for a while. It is a reversible disease. Often it is transient. It comes and goes. There are some interventions that we're doing, but in general, it is something that self-resolves after a few weeks or months. And it's thought that it is an immune disease or immune reaction where antibodies that have been generated against the virus or different viruses auto-react actually with the sheath, the myelin sheath that is protecting the peripheral nerve system. So it's basically a destruction of myelin in a process that's called demyelination, but it's transient and it can resolve itself. So the question now is whether there's a real connection between Zika and the Guillain-Barré syndrome based on potentially the neurotropism of Zika, or whether these increased cases are simply representing, or simply a reflection of that we have so many virally infected people now in Brazil and also in Polynesia like 2 years ago. And the numbers are not yet out there, but there's definitively a heightened alertness here. So the big question is what we can do against the virus, how to stop it. You all have heard about, travel limitations or, advices not to travel into, Zika endemic areas if you are, planning to become pregnant or if you are pregnant. And there's always, it's always important to protect against the mosquito bites. Because the mosquitoes have been, involved in transmission of other, diseases, viral diseases such as yellow fever and dengue fever, there's quite a bit of, approaches in place to try to stop the mosquito from spreading or from replicating itself, or from actually, being infected by the virus. And this includes traditional chemical techniques, but also more nifty genetically modified mosquitoes or bacterially infected mosquitoes that would then not become infected or would not be reproducing in the same manner that a usual mosquito would do. Now, the best thing would be to get the Zika vaccine, and everybody is in full gear to produce this. We have a good precedent because we have a dengue virus that has just been shown to be somewhat effective, not very effective. And the lessons that we're learning with dengue might also apply to Zika. So we have to be careful here. And the lesson is that when you get infected with one genotype, this infection does not protect you necessarily from the infection with another genotype. And contrary, it can actually make the infection with the other genotype worse. And this is a process where the antibodies that are generated against the first genotype are not really neutralizing and might actually enhance the uptake of the virus and the virulence of the second genotype that you might get infected with. And in dengue, this is a very dangerous situation because that can then lead to a very rampant infection and to a condition called dengue fever, hemorrhagic fever type of life-threatening disease. So we don't know how Zika is going to perform here and how easy it will be to develop a Zika vaccine. A treatment is definitively something that would be fantastic. We had recently very good, success with a treatment for hepatitis C virus, which is another flavivirus, not mosquito-borne, but in the same family of viruses. So the hope is that maybe some of this research might spill over into the current research against Zika virus. And it's definitively worth to envision that, especially for pregnant women, this could prevent the transmission from mother to child and prevent debilitating handicap here. And all of the flaviviruses are very sensitive to interferon treatment. So the 2015 Journal of Virology paper has already shown that the virus in the dish, at least infection in the dish, can be severely suppressed if the cells are being treated with interferon. So that might be something that in the interim might help in some cases. So while there's some things that we know about the Zika viruses, there's a lot more that we don't know, and I hope that I have brought this across. I think there's a time when a lot of researchers are moving into the area, and I think there will be a lot of very fast progress in the near future. There has been a call for very open sharing of results for Zika, and I think many people and many organizations and many journals have actually embraced this. So there might be a new culture, might be the start of a new culture to share scientific results early to really move the development of a vaccine and potentially a treatment further. And with this, I want to thank you for your attention. I want to specifically thank John Carroll, Teresa, and Giovanni Marchi for fantastic graphics. And thank you for your attention. And Krystal and I, we are really happy to take any further questions.
Thank you, Melanie. That was great. Krystal, please join the stage. So we are now entering a period of question and answers. There will be individuals in the room with microphones. We are live streaming, so please use the microphone when you ask your question. So here we go. Show me.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, I know a lot of pregnant women are advised not to take drugs as much as possible. So the classes of drugs that have been developed to stop HCV or dengue, do we know their effect on pregnancy at all? Has there been any studies?
I don't know about but I can tell you about interferon because I looked it up. Yes. There's a lot of risk of miscarriages, so it's probably not a very good treatment for pregnant women. At least they're early in the pregnancy.
And then there are currently no treatments specific for dengue at the time, so that would be, that might be possible.
So while others, please stage your question so we can get a microphone to you. I'll ask a question. What's known about genetic changes in this virus, the evolution of the virus as it's moved from French Polynesia to Brazil? How much change is occurring?
There's changes occurring. I mean, there's really currently two strains evolving, the African strain and the Asian strains, and the Brazilian strain is clearly close to the Asian strains. And within the difference between the Polynesian strains and the Brazilian strains, they are now very characteristic, variations in amino acids and certain genes evolving that are going to be tested now in their consequence in infection.
Other questions? Yes, Joan.
Is Zika virus likely to spread?
No, we need you to use the microphone.
You had a slide with a map. It looked like Zika's in Mexico currently. And is it likely to spread to California or other states?
Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, so as far as the United States, it's the way in which Zika virus infection is widespread is not assumed to be the case in the United States. And that's largely, there's chances that there can be local transmission, meaning that a person who travels in a place where Zika is spreading comes back to the United States, and then from there, there can be local transmission, whether it would be sexual transmission or between mosquito and humans. But the main difference is that in Central and Southern America, the mosquito population numbers are quite higher than what we see in the United States. And the the different Aedes mosquito populations in general are kind of limited within the United States based on the climate. And then in addition to that, it's just differences in lifestyle. So in the United States, we're far less likely to be outside as much, and so we're not in contact with mosquitoes. Our windows and doors are typically closed, and we have air conditioning, which the mosquitoes don't prefer. So as of now, it's not a concern that it's going to go widespread in North America.
So I'll ask an interval question. You've both just been appointed team physicians to the U.S. women's soccer team that will be competing in Rio de Janeiro, actually competing in outlying areas of Brazil. What would be your advice to the team in terms of the risk of Zika? Should they not go? There's been one particularly prominent player who indicates she has concerns about competing.
Well, I think the Brazilians have decided that they will go on with that they will stage the Olympic Games. They will not cancel them because of the Zika epidemic. The other thing that I would also note is that actually the numbers in Brazil are going down currently. So the epidemic seems to have reached its height, and it might, go a little bit easier. So there might be much less infected people around that the mosquito can feed on, and so that the transmission risk might actually be slightly diminished. But I think in general it's a very personal decision, especially for young women, and the risk is definitively still there. There's a lot of protection measurements that I pointed out, especially avoiding being bitten by a mosquito, and I think that's the biggest thing that somebody can do.
Now this, in contrast to many mosquitoes that bite at night and at dusk or dawn, is it not true that this mosquito bites in the day?
Yeah, many of the Aedes species, especially Albopictus, is actually a very avid biter during the day, yes. So.
Other questions?
So
Yes,
the
please.
neurotropism, as you mentioned earlier, of Zika has been well documented for a long time. So why is the microcephaly concern, is that something that's believed to be unique to the Brazil strain, or has this been noted prior?
I think it has, when we have looked through all the reports that have been published, not many have been published before 2007, actually. So some deformations of the babies were noted in Polynesia. That was the first time, but that was also the first time when we had really a lot of people infected. It is unclear yet whether the virus, has changed and become somehow very selective in infecting a specific population of neurons in the developing baby that could cause this very characteristic disease, or whether it is just that we did not have the numbers of infections to make this a global health concern, basically. That's all very good questions and something that will have to be examined.
Please.
How much do we know at this point about the life cycle of the virus once it's infected someone? For example, a woman perhaps gives birth to a child with microcephaly. Are subsequent children also at risk, et cetera?
So the infection is actually resolves usually in patients. So if you get bitten, often only 20% of people only know that they're actually having a Zika viral infection. They become symptomatic and developing the fever. Many are expected to have very, very mild symptoms so that they would not be even noticing that they are infected. And there's, development of neutralizing antibodies. So the disease is, thought to be resolved. So I would not have a concern for future babies unless there could be a reinfection happening. that could, kindle another, infection.
Yes, please. We'll get you a microphone.
It's working? Hi. What else is known about the mechanism of microcephaly? Like, how is,
Yes.
is it a developmental problem, or is it a neuron death problem? Or?
It is actually a very interesting question. I think most we know about microcephalies come from genetic microcephalies. There is sort of a series of autosomal recessive microcephalies being described, and these have pointed to very unique genes. All of these genes are involved in cell division. They are all involved with the centrosome. And it is thought that microcephaly, which is very uniquely actually a deficit in neurons in the neocortex, that it might result, or that microcephaly might be when progenitor neurons, neuronal progenitors, do not expand sufficiently before they start to become, neurons. And so that is what we know from the genetic side. There is a lot of, so that I would say is the best molecular characterization that we have. Now, with these new, results looking at the brains of the babies that are Zika infected, I think we will learn a lot more where the virus is. It really looks from this one report, that's the first report that we have, that it is a very widespread and very rampant destruction with a lot of calcification. So there's a lot of neuronal death happening.
Yes, please.
There we go. I'm more familiar with dengue virus, and I know with dengue there's big hepatic involvement and a lot of issues with especially hemorrhagic fever. When people get infected with Zika, are there can they die from Zika? Is it usually just a mild fever and a rash and it goes away?
So there have been multiple reports of deaths that are associated with Zika virus. As of now, there's no hemorrhagic component that's been linked to Zika virus, so not there. But certainly in the case of babies being born with microcephaly, some die within hours or weeks of birth. Sometimes the infection of the mother will lead to the fetus miscarrying. And then there's also been a couple of reports where there was an adult man that was immunocompromised, and he had died, and they had detected Zika virus. And then similarly, a young teenage girl who was also infected with Zika virus, and it seemingly was healthy otherwise, has also died.
So immunosuppression is certainly not a good thing, because that can cause the virus to get more systemic. But I think also the interesting part is whether it infects, the testes or other organs. I mean, there's definitively indication with the hematospermia, that was the blood in the semen that was reported. So far it seems to be a very, relatively mild, smaller, younger cousin of the dengue fever. And people were actually very relieved in Brazil when they found out it was Zika after they looked at the pictures, because they had thought it might be something worse. But they only got concerned when the microcephaly cases came up. Before, they were actually relieved.
Chris.
So flaviviruses in general get cleared from the bloodstream relatively well by the immune system, but you mentioned that Zika is unusually neurotropic. Do you think it may persist longer once it's been cleared from the plasma in the nervous system, and is that maybe the reason it causes these problems?
So I can't address how long the virus is within the brain, because as of now it's only been detected. You can confirm this, but so far only in the brains of microcephalic babies. Yes. We do know that in the blood the virus clears within roughly a week, but they have been detecting virus both in the saliva, the urine, and semen weeks after it's been cleared in the blood. So it appears that virus can still be replicating after the virus in the blood is no longer detectable.
Yes, I think we had it. Who has the microphone? Oh, you do. Please.
I kind of towards the end of your talk, you had insinuated about the potential for using hepatitis C, all these hepatitis C drugs that we have against dengue and Zika. I assume maybe somebody's going to try this with Zika, but I was curious if there's any precedent with that in using the hepatitis C medications against dengue or other, other viruses, and if there's any plans for that with Zika in your reading about that.
Yeah, so I didn't want to imply that we use the drugs that we have because they might not work. They're relatively specific for the proteases or polymerase of the hepatitis C. But what I wanted to imply is that we had very good success with them, and there's probably a lot in the pipeline that could be used to, test it now specifically against the Zika virus. So I don't think there's any precedent that the HCV drug directly was used against other, but it might definitely worth just a shot, if you want to try it in the dish, because they suppress viral replication very efficiently if you add it to the cell culture. So that could definitely be tested, but I think the idea is more to use the knowledge gained in that process to apply to Zika drugs.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the dengue vaccine? You mentioned that it's not completely effective. What should we be aiming at or expecting in terms of a Zika virus vaccine? What's the likelihood of being able to create an effective vaccine?
So as far as the dengue vaccine, as Melanie was mentioning, dengue is really unique in the fact that there's 4 different serotypes, and that antibodies that are mounted from that primary infection of a certain serotype, if you are then infected a second time with a different serotype, those antibodies that were mounted from that first response will actually lead to enhanced viral uptake and enhanced viremia that second time around. So the complications with developing a vaccine for dengue, because it took over 20 years, was the fact that you needed an immune response against all 4 of the serotypes, and that it needed to, essentially the vaccine needed to elicit neutralizing concentrations of antibodies across the board. And so that was what was the main complication with developing a dengue vaccine. As to whether or not this is going to be a similar situation with Zika, it's not known as far as different serotypes. The antibody-dependent enhancement that Melanie mentioned with dengue virus has been suggested in very preliminary in vitro studies with Zika, so it's certainly something that is on the minds of researchers as they develop a vaccine.
Yes, at the back.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was about to ask about. So I've heard there's a lot of cross-reactivity between dengue and Zika antibodies, which makes it very difficult to clinically diagnose the different viruses without a PCR-based test. Absolutely. So is there any evidence that people who have pregnant women who give birth to microencephalitic babies, do they have prior exposure to dengue virus? Do you get antibody-dependent enhancement with Zika virus due to previous exposure to dengue at all? Is there any evidence of that?
Yeah, definitely a very good thought that is on the mind of many people, because there's a lot of dengue. I mean, especially in Polynesia, there was just a dengue outbreak at the same time when the Zika outbreak was. So there is definitely the thought that maybe the worse, outcome, especially with the microcephaly, might be caused via some help from the dengue antibodies. But
yeah, there's definitely, as you mentioned, as far as trying to diagnose whether or not these individuals, via serological tests, whether or not they've been infected with Zika, has been confounded by the fact that antibodies generated from other flavivirus infections, particularly dengue, are cross-reactive. But it's certainly a huge concern. Even Melanie mentioned French Polynesia, but the same thing has occurred in Brazil, where there was a huge surge of dengue infections in 2015, so the same year that Zika infections started skyrocketing. And so even from 2014 to 2015 in Brazil, there was a difference between 500,000 reported cases to 1.5 million cases of dengue. So there could definitely be some sort of interaction. There could be most certainly a concern at this point.
Well, for now, it's actually an advantage for the researchers because we can use some of the dengue antibodies to detect Zika without making all the antibodies from scratch. So that's one of the advantages, but the disadvantages are, of course, obvious.
Yes, please, at the back. Yeah, no, you.
Yes, so I
Sorry.
guess it's a slightly different flavor of the same question, but if you compare Brazil to other regions where Zika is endemic, and then look at the other flaviviruses that have gone through those regions, is there any interesting observations around those histories that could contribute to the way that the disease is being manifested in Brazil?
Well, it's definitely an interesting question that's being looked at. I mean, many people have, looked at dengue, but I think the net is going to be casted much more wider. And the big question is also, why has Africa not seen such a big, emergence? And at the beginning, actually, when the virus was discovered in 47, they also examined, seroprevalence of antibodies there, and it was very low. It was sort of at about 6%, I think, in the area. It has since risen to about 60% in some areas, specifically in Nigeria. But it has never led to a huge, outbreak or a microcephaly crisis. So it is probably due because people are less densely packed in Africa. But there's a lot of, discussion about this. Or because the virus was less dangerous in Africa.
You mentioned that dendritic cells can become infected with Zika. Is the virus cytopathic in the dendritic cells, or is it simply moving throughout the body kind of in a neutral way with the dendritic cells?
So that's not necessarily known as of yet with Zika virus. As Melanie mentioned, that it was a very recent paper that showed that Zika virus can infect different cell types at the site of initial infection. So when you imagine a mosquito biting a human, with dengue, it's a similar situation where it's the local skin resident dendritic cells that become infected at that initial point when the mosquito bites a human, and then it's thought that at that point the dendritic cells travel, and then those infected dendritic cells can then pass on the virus to monocytes and macrophages, and ultimately that can lead to the severe disease following that secondary infection. So it's kind of that spread and all of your important immune cell types being infected.
Any additional questions? Well, if not, I want to take this opportunity to especially thank Melanie and Krystal for an outstanding series of presentations and answers to your questions. I want to thank the audience for attending today. This is I hope that you've enjoyed this informational briefing from the Gladstone Institutes, and we look forward to joining you, hopefully for not yet the next viral outbreak. But thank you for your attendance.